P3, 1.f. It's not often that poets write their poems in two different languages. Pat Mora is a poet who does this often. She enjoys using English and Spanish in her writing because both languages have always been very important to her. Pat was born in El Paso, Texas on January 19, 1942. Her family had come to the United States from Mexico in the early 1900s. It was a time of war in Mexico. Pat's grandparents had wanted a more peaceful life for their families. Like many children of Mexican heritage, Pat spoke two languages. She spoke mostly English with her parents, her two sisters, and her brother. With her grandparents and aunt, Pat spoke Spanish. Pat grew up in a bilingual home. Pat enjoyed speaking two languages at home, but sometimes she felt shy about speaking Spanish at school where all the subjects were taught in English. As a girl, Pat loved to read. She once wrote, "When the desert wind howled outside, I felt safe in my bed with a book." Her love of reading was encouraged by her family. There were always books at home, and if Pat needed more, her mother would drive her to the library. Pat also loved hearing the stories her Aunt Ignacia told about growing up in Mexico. Her aunt told some of these stories in English and some in Spanish. Her aunt's stories were very inspiring. Later, Pat wrote a book with a character based on Ignacia. Pat didn't always want to be a writer. In high school, she wanted to be a doctor. Even though she loved to read and listen to stories, she didn't think she would be a writer. She had never seen a writer who was bilingual like her. Instead of starting a writing career, Pat went to college and earned a master's degree. She worked at different jobs, including teaching. Pat taught school for many years. Pat has said, "I'm a writer because I'm a reader." Reading had always been a very enjoyable experience for Pat. She started to write so that she could bring joy to other readers. In the 1980s and 1990s, Pat won several awards that allowed her to write full-time. This helped her concentrate on perfecting her writing and making it the best it could be. Pat has written books for all ages of readers. Some of her books are for children, some are for teens, and others for adults. Pat also writes different kinds of books. Many of her books are poetry, but she also enjoys writing fiction and nonfiction. She writes about what life is like for a Mexican-American family living in the United States. As an adult, Pat feels lucky to be bilingual. She says, "When I write, I can use words in English or Spanish. I can write cat or gato." Pat often includes Spanish words or phrases in her poems written in English. Pat uses Spanish words in a poem called Song to Mothers. In the poem, she writes that her mother's laugh is a canción verde. The words canción verde mean green song. These Spanish words help show Pat's feelings about her mother's laughter. The Spanish words also bring wonderful sounds to the poem. Pat writes about traditions that are unique to Mexican-American culture. Some of her poems mention Mexican games such as hitting birthday piñatas, foods such as empanadas, and visits to a Mexican bakery. Pat wants her poems to express the richness and joy of being Mexican-American. Pat says, "I have deep affection for Mexican and Mexican-American culture, so it's a joy to write about it." Pat also writes about important themes that many cultures share. She has written a lot about family. In 1992, Pat's book, A Birthday Party for Tia, was published. Tia is the Spanish word for aunt. The aunt in the story was based on her tia Ignacia. Pat has encouraged all children to read, so that they can experience the same joy that she felt when she was reading as a child. Pat has helped start Dia de los Niños, Dia de los Libros, or Children's Day, Book Day. It takes place each year on April 30th, the last day of National Poetry Month. Schools and libraries host activities to celebrate reading and writing in many languages and about many cultures. Pat Mora continues to write award-winning books for children of all ages. She loves to write about the desert lands near El Paso and her childhood there. Her poems keep alive the wonderful Mexican-American heritage her family has helped bring to the United States.